In this lecture, we're going to be talking about the state of the Jewish people at the beginning of the New Testament. So, in previous lectures, you've learned about some of the key events and characters of the Old Testament, and you've learned a little bit about the things that happened between the Old and the New Testament in those 400 years of silence. And now in this video, as we prepare to dig into the New Testament a little bit at a time, it's important to have an idea of kind of just where the Jewish people were in terms of their thoughts and their perspective on the world around them. So that's what we're going to do in this video, and I think it can really help as we do begin to look at the specifics of the New Testament. So here we go. One thing you have to understand from the very beginning, before you even open the New Testament, is that Judaism, the religion of the Jewish people, was not ever just like a fringe part of Jewish life. It wasn't like religion can sometimes be for people today, where religion was just kind of on the fringe of your life. Instead, Judaism was the very center of the Jewish people's life. It was their guiding star. It was what they oriented their whole life around. And so when their religion is taken this seriously, you can see how this is going to affect their life. So their religious life is going to spill out into every other part of their life. So that's the first thing you have to understand. Next, if we're going to accurately understand where the Jewish people are at the beginning of the New Testament, we need to recall some things that happened in the Old Testament. So if you're not familiar, we're going to just brush up on some things that are really important for you to know because they play into the New Testament. So if you remember, or if you don't remember, Yahweh, or God, the God of the Old Testament, same God as the New Testament, Yahweh, God, had entered into a covenant with Israel, and he had made some major promises to the people of Israel. And so this covenant was, it was supposed to work both ways, that it was a covenant between God and man, between this Jewish group, this people group that God had chosen. And so there were stipulations on both sides. Within this covenant, God told the Jewish people how that they should live. But in return, God made promises to these people, and there were some major promises, such as he would make them a great nation through the person of Abraham. He would eventually make it to where the Jewish people are ruling the world, and basically he would be their God and they would be his people. So there would be no other religions around them. They were to be fully devoted to God. Okay, so keep these promises in mind because these are going to play into the status or the state of the Jewish people come the time of the New Testament. So as the people are, going through this arc, this big storyline from the Old Testament all the way throughout the New, we see that there's this kind of up and down quality to the relationship between God and the Jewish people. So we talked about this covenant that they had, and even though Yahweh remained faithful in keeping his promises and in being the God to his people weren't always obedient. Sometimes they would stray away from God and they would kind of do their own thing, and then they would ask for forgiveness and they would come back to God. And so there was this up and down trajectory of their relationship throughout the Old Testament. But what we find towards the end of the Old Testament is that even though there had been times where they had been disobedient and they had strayed from God, by the end of the Old Testament, they really are longing for God to make things right. And they're longing for their relationship with God to be right again. And so they, through the promises of the Old Testament, through different passages in the Old Testament, there began to be this set of expectations of what God was going to do when he came to make things right. And so we'll see that the Jewish people have hope, but it's hope for some specific things. And so we need to talk about those now. Now, there are expectations that we could say are kind of all over the place, that different people were hoping and expecting for different things. But if we can just narrow it down to some broad expectations that basically all Jewish people had, it would be this. First, that the restoration of the 12 tribes would come about. So the 12 tribes of Israel was a major part of the Old Testament, and by the end, they're scattered. They're no longer the 12 tribes, and so they have this expectation of the restoration of these tribes. They also have the expectation that they should be able to purely worship Yahweh. So once again, there's all of this Old Testament stuff playing into this attitude, or playing into this mindset of this desire to once again purely worship Yahweh. That means that at some point in the Old Testament, they were not able to do that. Same thing with a purified temple. They want to get back to this place where they can worship in the temple purely. And then finally, they have this specific expectation that the Messiah will come and make things right. Now, we have a whole set of videos and all of this stuff about who the Messiah is and what the expectations were of the Messiah. But just know that the Jewish people were hoping and looking for this messianic figure that would come in the name of Yahweh and would make things right. So, there's the expectations they had and would have had at the beginning of the New Testament. So now, as we come into the beginning of the New Testament, as we basically put yourselves as if you're just putting yourself down into the world where, we open the New Testament and it's the book of Matthew. The world that Matthew is writing in, that's what we're looking at. That's what we're thinking about. So, what were those Jews thinking then? How were things going? Well, we just went over the 4 expectations that they had, the 4 specific ways that they wanted God to make things right. And, okay, so now let's look at, are those expectations being met? The tribal restoration? No. The tribes are not restored, and the people are not ruling over themselves independently. Instead, they're being ruled over by the Romans, a major world power at that time. So definitely not independent, definitely not ruling over the world as they knew had been promised by God in the Old Testament. So, tribal restoration? No, hasn't happened. Pure worship? No. There's tension between the Jewish religious groups, which we'll talk about more, and there was a lot of just unrighteousness just going on throughout the Jewish people. So they had this desire for pure worship, and they knew that that was this end goal to get back to, but there was still a lot of just a lot of things that were hindering them from pure worship. And the same thing with the purified temple. The divine presence of God that was there in the temple in the Old Testament was still missing. And though they had a temple at this time, it was just a mere shadow of the original temple. And so it was not the powerful icon that it was in the Old Testament. And so a purified temple had not occurred. And then finally, the arrival of the Messiah. It had been 400 years of silence between the end of the Old Testament, when things are wrapping up in the Old Testament, and now the beginning of the New Testament. And so these people are waiting, and yet there's still no Messiah. There's still no messenger of God to say what's going on, what God's agenda is. And so the people are just waiting. They're waiting on the Messiah. They're waiting on how God is going to act next. So all of that sounds pretty discouraging. Things are not how they want them, how the Jewish people want them to be. And yet they continue to wait, and they wait with hope. And so as you dig into the New Testament, keep this in mind, that the Jewish people, they had some major expectations. They had some major things that they were asking God to do in their life and really in the whole world. And they're struggling with this disappointment that things are not how they want to be, how they want things to be. But they're waiting and they're hoping and they're trying to not get discouraged, and they're just waiting with hope for the day that they hear from Yahweh again.